smell bullshit jobs in higher education, we're actually extending previous work that we did and that's published, although it hasn't quite come out yet. And in a sense, what we're doing is we're taking the works of Thorsten Veblen and then later the anthropologist David Graeber, and looking at the extent to which there are these bullshit jobs, as David Graeber called them, jobs that don't really serve a useful function. And that's even the people working those jobs would kind of admit that to one degree or another. In this particular article, what we're doing is extending that prior work to specifically the area of higher education. So this links us to questions of what's sometimes called administrative bloat, the non-faculty kind of proliferation of employments within higher education. So just to kind of summarize that, a couple of key stats, and this is specific to the United States. Between 76 and 2018, U.S. higher educational institutions saw a 78% increase in student enrollment, a 92% increase in faculty, and a 164% increase in executive and administrative jobs. And this is the biggest components. The other professionals components of that employment within these institutions increased by 452%. So what we do in this paper is we kind of analyze the nature of all of these non-educational, non-instructional positions, non-research positions within American institutions of higher ed, and kind of ask the question, to what extent might some of these, or even many of these jobs be, as David Graeber called, bullshit jobs? So that's kind of the summary. I'll pass it off to Rich to talk about the empirical work we did here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Erik. Yeah, so just to add to that, obviously this work really focuses on higher education. Erik and I and the other co-authors were both very well versed in the higher education system in the United States, being members of that very industry. And so, as far as how to put empirics to all of this work, the question came down to: is there a data set that we could find that speaks to the question or could be used as a proxy for bullshit jobs? The best way that we could think of it was to use a data set called the National Survey of College Graduates. And in that survey, a series of questions were asked. The one we thought was perhaps the most unique and perhaps the most important and relevant to our work was the question of, when an individual was thinking about their principal job, the job that they spend the majority of the time doing, how will they rate, right, their satisfaction of that job with respect to their job's contribution to society? Therefore, if somebody sees their job as not contributing to society, then we believe that that fits or closely aligns with Graeber's sort of conception of bullshit jobs, but also with Veblen's assertion that higher education really should be kind of committed to improving the acquisition of knowledge, so on and so forth, and not all these kind of excess services, which have happened to grow tremendously in the United States and elsewhere in the modern period. So the data set we use, National Survey of College Graduates. We use, in essence, a logistic model. And therefore, what we're really trying to explain is the likelihood, given certain individual characteristics about people who are in the higher education system, as well as institutional characteristics about the institution itself, and the various categories of their jobs. We wanted to understand what is the likelihood that someone will say that their job is in fact a bullshit job. The key sort of variables of interest here that we really care about understanding really are, to what extent are these job categories, right? So taskmasters, as Graeber defines it, faculty, graduate students, researchers, to what extent are these individuals in fact believing that their job contributes to society? So our first hypothesis that we looked at really was that other professionals, which would be those individuals that Erik mentioned had grown about 400%. So you can think of some of these people as, in essence, not being part of the instructional roles, right? But they're kind of ancillary and in support of those instructional roles. We categorize them using Graeber's typology as either flunkies, goons, duct tapers, or box tickers. And our primary assertion is that these other professionals will have the lowest levels of perceived social contribution, and that is compared to all higher education professional staff and administrators. So that is to say that this category of workers in the higher education system are likely to believe that their jobs are bullshit, which would be consistent with a lot of the work that Graeber had done and talked about. The second hypothesis that we really wanted to focus on and look at was the role of the taskmasters, which would be the administrative class, which is that group in higher education that had grown so tremendously. I believe Erik mentioned 160 something percent over that period of time. So you can think of these as being your presidents and chancellors and provosts. And in the paper, we spend a little time kind of making a distinction between, those that have budgetary control and those that don't. And so the main assertion here is that we believe, and the empirics bear it out, that these taskmasters, right, the administrative class in the higher education institutions, are likely, right, to report a higher level of social contribution relative to other non-academic staff. In other words, they don't believe that their job is bullshit. Now, this argument here is particularly powerful because in Graeber's work, he actually found that these type of taskmasters were more likely to even probably be upset at the very question that their jobs was in fact bullshit. So I'll kind of pause there and let Erik kind of take it over again.
Yeah, so we largely concluded that that Graeber's work, and it may be worth noting, Graeber's work was based on essentially a series of more or less informal interviews, kind of pulled from a series of Twitter kind of campaigns, I guess you might call them, but fairly extensive kind of fleshing out of ideas from these conversations he had, and we've largely been able to empirically verify or fail to disconfirm, let's say, those observations, including here in higher education in particular. Graeber, of course, worked in higher education, so he had quite a few kind of personal insights into that particular industry in the U.S. and in the U.K. And yes, we've mainly verified these results through these logit models we've done. Why is this important? It's important for a number of reasons. In the broader context of this idea of bullshit jobs, which we've again in a previous paper connected to various ideas within institutional economics. It's important because it can kind of address the nature of the actual work being done in modern industrialized nations in a general sense. If you go back to, old Keynesian ideas of hiring some people to dig holes and other people to dig up the things we buried in the first place, getting that approximately correct. One can make the argument that we have essentially done that in a sense, but through that we've proliferated, and of course Keynes was saying that in jest, but we've proliferated a number of occupations or employments that maybe don't even necessarily need to be done. In the context of higher ed specifically, and this would only really be consistent with what you see in the general trends in both the private and public sector. It's worth noting this is not just a public sector phenomenon that we found. In the context of higher ed specifically, this of course is important because not only does it lead to the kind of lack of fulfillment of a lot of people doing the work in these jobs, feeling unsatisfied with their social contribution, but it also leads to higher educational costs, right? So of course, all of these people have to be paid, which means ultimately that translates in the US, especially, it translates into higher tuition costs. I think that'd be true in the UK as well. Um,
Yeah, and just to add to what Erik is saying, right? I think one of the things that we were really interested in understanding too is like, across all of our universities and many other universities, you see all these really interesting titles, right, being given to what Graeber will consider taskmasters, right, or the people that he would consider unnecessary superiors, right? And you ask yourself, right, that vice president for student engagement and success and initiatives. Well, who exactly is that, and what exactly does that person do? And also the extension of that to what Erik is pointing to is that if this person was to be gone, in other words, not be in that role, how will that diminish sort of the educational process and the educational sort of outcomes? And what we've essentially sort of made the argument and shown is that yes, Graeber is right. These are, in fact, on average, unnecessary superiors, right? So I think our work matters a lot, especially for, I would argue that if you are in the higher education industry and you do see this continued proliferation of all these fancy titles and big roles, a basic question needs to be asked: is the job still being done? If these Will the job still be done if these people were not around? And I think the answer is yes, perhaps maybe even much better. So I mean, I think one of the things that we were kind of struck at, or we kind of thought about was, obviously there's some limitations to our data. So for example, people are being asked about their perception, right? So that in and of itself is a bit limiting. However, that is the data that's available, and that's the best that we could use, and it still tells the story, right, in a very coherent way. I think, where do we go next? We had discussed, Erik, if you recall, it would be great if we had some kind of longitudinal data, right? So we could actually sort of measure some of these changes or the evolution in kind of the bureaucratic structures and the relative importance of those jobs over time. So we looked a little bit at that. We also, you know, so I think we say in the paper actually, that time series data analysis will shed light on the bureaucratic structures and intra-organizational power and bullshit jobs. And also, one thing that we haven't included or sort of thought about in any meaningful sense is to what extent does sort of demographic characteristics, right, maybe perhaps play a role in bullshit jobs, right? Do we find, I don't know, a certain group of people doing more of the bullshit jobs versus others? So that could be an interesting extension of this work, and that's something that we also mention a bit in the paper. Um, so yeah, I'll pause there, Erik, and see if you have anything else you'd like to add.
yeah, I think those were the main ones in terms of future research. In terms of policy implications, of course, there's in the U.S. been a lot of debate about government funding for higher education, which of course I would support, and I think most people do. Um, this kind of sheds some lights, though, on exactly where do those funds go when they finally do trickle into the institutions, to the extent that uh, that the federal monies, state monies, local monies, as well as tuition dollars, uh, really go to just inflate non-instructional bureaucracies.
Right.
That suggests that there's more than just a funding issue within higher education, that it kind of is organizational as well. And the fact that you see this trend not just in colleges and universities, and not just in for or nonprofits or governments institutions too. This is true in for-profits, colleges and universities to a lesser extent, actually, but it's still true, as well as American corporations, as well as
Yep.
government bureaucracies. This is not an intractable problem, but a very kind of fundamental problem that would have to be addressed in addition to funding considerations. So,
Yeah. So again, to put it in a what Erik said so beautifully in another way would be, every time you think about, as Ginsburg would actually support, every time you think about all those administrative retreats and strategic plans and strategic lunches and things like that are being funded, right? The question is, to what extent are these necessary, right? If in fact the people that are doing these jobs are themselves taskmasters who are necessary superiors, as Graeber will argue, then to what extent are we, to be frank, perhaps wasting resources, right? Which are ultimately going to fund these nice and fancy retreats and so forth. And to Eric's point, this is not just a higher education issue. At least in the U.S., it's it permeates every aspect of work. I recall during the Great Recession, AIG was asking for a bailout, but yet they were throwing a big corporate party, right? Somewhere, somewhere, I think in Vegas or Mexico or something like that, right? So we think this job, our paper really where it goes next is kind of digging deeper into other confounding factors, like are there certain particular people, demographics that are doing certain jobs of these bullshit jobs? How have these bullshit jobs evolved over time? We think that's interesting, but fundamentally, as the question, right? Like, to what extent do our jobs contribute to society? Right? To what extent do they contribute? And if they don't, should we be dedicating as much of the resources and the social provisioning to those types of activities?